like to invite Mr. 존비기뉴기조연설, Chairman of Creative England for the keynote speech. 존비기뉴기조연설, 크리에이티브 잉글랜드 이사장님 무대 위로 모시겠습니다. 큰 박수로 환영해 주시기 바랍니다. Please welcome him with a big round of applause.
Thank you very much, and good morning to everybody. This is my first visit to Korea, so it's been a great pleasure for me being able to spend a day in Seoul as a tourist, and now a day doing some work on this very important area of the creative economy and creative industries. I'm going to talk a little bit about our experience in the UK, and also see if we can draw some lessons that all of us need to learn, because we are still learning in the UK, about how we create a more effective and dynamic creative economy in the future. And I'd like to start by addressing this question: what do we mean by the creative economy? I think, interestingly, probably one of the best speeches about the creative industries that's ever been made by a politician was made almost 100 years ago, when President Woodrow Wilson of the United States, making a speech about the rebuilding of the US and European economy after the First World War, said a very interesting thing. He said, "Trade follows the film." And by that he meant, where American movies go, American business will follow. Now remember, this was made in 1918. The film industry had barely begun. It was not regarded as a very respectable industry, and yet the president had the foresight to understand that the value of the film industry to the United States was not just the dollars that were earned from the movies, but the fact that where American films went, American business would follow. And we all know, where American movies go, there go Levi Jeans and Coca-Cola and Disneyland and McDonald's and so on. So his vision was absolutely proved accurate. And in the UK, 15 years ago, in 1997, when a new government was elected, we began to think, how do we learn these lessons from the United States that have been so effective in protecting some of their industries? And we wanted to look on a broader basis at the creative industries. But in any language, I think you will agree that two of the most difficult words to understand are creativity and culture. We can all argue about what they mean for hours, but we decided to start with a definition of the creative industries which looked at the value of intellectual property. And this was the definition which we arrived at: those activities which have their origin in individual creativity, skill, and talent, and which have a potential for wealth and job creation through the generation and exploitation of intellectual property. And many people said to us, this is crazy. The pharmaceuticals industry is creative, the engineering industry is creative, every industry is creative. But we were trying to pin down what is this particular area of economic activity which also has real cultural impact. And these were the areas of expertise and enterprise that we chose. And I think they were well chosen. It was a good place to start. But of course, you will see from that list that we've mixed many different kinds of industry. There are content businesses in that list. There are distribution businesses in that list. And there are also enterprises which are business to business rather than business to consumer. So advertising, architecture, marketing, these are businesses which are business to business industries. And we then went on to seek to spread these ideas around the world to some extent. And you will know as well as I do that there are no two governments anywhere in the world that will agree on a definition of the creative economy. But the important thing is everybody, every government in the world now recognizes that this is a crucial part of the global economy for the next 100 years. This is a table which shows you the variety of different trades and businesses that different countries have adopted in defining the creative industries. And interestingly, I have been lobbied quite often in different parts of the world as to why we didn't have food and cuisine as one of our creative industries. And of course, what is more an expression of culture than food. And it seems to me you can say food is a creative industry. If you looked at that in a Korean context, you could say food is definitely part of Korean culture. It's part of a definition of what it means to be Korean. So we will never ever finally decide what are the boundaries that we mean by the creative industries, but everybody recognizes their importance. As we began to develop our policies in the UK, we also realized that that definition of architecture, music, film, television, so on, was not sufficiently broad to capture the real impact of creativity in the economy. And last year, an organization called NESTA, the National Endowment for Science, Technology and the Arts, which is an independent charity in the UK, produced this document, a manifesto for the creative economy. And how they chose to define the creative industries and the creative economy was like this: those sectors which specialize in the use of creative talent for commercial purposes. In other words, it is in fact the entire economy, parts of which are creative. Even in the area of retail, there are creative jobs within retail. There are creative jobs within every area of activity. And if we're going to capture the value of creativity in economic terms, we need to be looking at that much larger picture. And on this definition, the number of people employed in the creative economy in the UK is around 2.5 million. The value that's being generated for the economy is around 9%. It is probably the single biggest sector, if you look at it as a sector, in the economy, and it is going to go on increasing in its significance. So, what does that mean worldwide? If you look at these figures from the United Nations, you'll see that it's not just happening in some advanced countries around the world. This is something which is happening everywhere in the world, north and south, east and west. The United Nations, every 3 years, produce a report on the creative industries, and each report emphasizes the fact that this is growing rapidly right around the world. Every part of the world is experiencing this growth. That's a growth in this slide of almost 9% a year for the last 9 years in the creative industries. But if you look at this part of the report, if you look at the trade in cultural goods and services from Latin America, from Africa, and from parts of Asia, it is even higher, 12%. Now, one of the lessons that we draw from that is, if we're going to understand how we develop the creative industries effectively, this is not just a matter of producing high-tech, high-value, high-price products and services. It's a mass market, and it's a mass industry, and we're accessing huge numbers of people around the world. For the African economies, what they want are products and services that are simple and, above all, are cheap. And we have to bear that in mind when we're developing our policies in the more advanced economies for creative industries. But we also began to think, our thinking about the creative industries in the UK was very much what I would call the supply side. In other words, we were thinking, how do we support these businesses? We were not looking at it from the consumer side to say, what is the demand side for these industries? How should we be thinking about developing the policies for them in terms of demand? And so I want to make a few points now about an alternative way of looking at the development of the creative economy. And the first thing is, it grows from communities, it grows from cities. Of course it does. We are all living in cities, and the creative industries are not just commodities like any other. They are an expression of the culture of the countries that we live in and of the cities that we live in. Secondly, the way in the relationship between producers and consumers is changing radically. This is a screen grab from YouTube. You will know that YouTube offers an opportunity for anybody to put up interesting content online. This is something which did not exist even a few years ago. And the companies that are succeeding most effectively in this new economy are the companies that understand that there is a different relationship between producers and consumers. And it's often said that the company that understood that first and most effectively was Google, because Google made a decision that rather than developing their own business themselves, they would allow their users to develop the business in the way they wanted, and they would respond to their users. In other words, where in the old paradigm of running any business, the issue that we're all driving for is how do we persuade the consumers to trust the producer? How do we persuade the person who's buying the product to trust the company that's making the product? In this new economy, the people who are making the product must learn to trust the people who are buying the product. It's a complete reversal of the story, and that's certainly true of Google, and it's been responsible for part of Google's success. Secondly, what's happening in education and learning is changing radically. I would bet that these two little girls probably understand how to use the internet better than any of us in this room because they are 5 years old. They have an instinctive understanding. They are, if you like, natives of this new world. And that means that how we approach learning and education has to change absolutely radically. It's not a matter of saying there is no role for the teacher, of course not. But it means that how we teach young people to use and exploit these technologies is different. And a very quick example of that, I am involved in a project in the UK that gives money to children to make films. We've commissioned about almost 2,000 films in the last 15 years. And some of the children go from 5 years old to 20 years old. And it's extraordinary how 6, 7, 8-year-old kids can now make good movies. And of course they need some guidance, they need some help. But they understand how to use the technology. They don't need somebody to explain to them how to use a camera. What they do need is somebody to help them construct the stories that they want to tell. So it's not that there isn't a role for the teacher in this new world, but the relationship between the teacher and the student has to be rethought, and we have to address that question if we're going to have successful creative economies. And the next point, if you're going to have great content, you have to have great consumers. This is a photograph of a concert. If you don't have an audience that wants to have high-quality music, you will not have a performer who's offering high-quality music. I went to a concert by the Seoul Philharmonic Orchestra on Saturday, which was a great privilege. And the standard of that orchestra is extraordinarily high, and the quality of engagement by the audience is high. And the way that orchestra will get better and better is because the audience demands more and more. So if we're going to have a great creative economy, it's not just a matter of having good content producers. You have to have a consumer base of people who demand quality. Demand needs to be demanding. And I think that that is something which in education terms and in terms of the way we think about the future of our societies, we ignore at our peril. It's a very, very important issue. Finally, we also know that in this new world, the old business models are turned completely upside down. I'm sure many of you are familiar with the game Candy Crush. Now, if you had gone to a banker with the idea of Candy Crush and said, I have a great idea for a company that's going to be worth hundreds of millions of dollars, and this is it, they would say, you're crazy, get out. But actually, it has become a hugely successful business. And the thing that is extraordinary about Candy Crush is it's played by hundreds of millions of people around the world, but most of them aren't paying anything. What Candy Crush do is they engage that small proportion of their users who then go on to a new level of the game, and they pay tiny amounts of money, but because there are so many of them, it's made it into a hugely valuable company. It's a very, very different business model because it starts with giving something away free and then earning money later on in very small quantities, but a lot of it. And that is, again, something which I think we have difficulty sometimes in thinking about how we plan investment in new businesses to adapt some of these new models which are beginning to drive the new technologies and the most successful businesses on the internet. So, here is a quote from the Duke of Edinburgh in the UK. The obvious answer to everything are nearly always wrong. Now, he said this in the context of talking about design and saying he has a very famous design award, the Duke of Edinburgh's Design Award, which is given each year in the UK. And he said one of the values of designers in our society is that we see a problem, we think we know the solution, but very often that solution is not the right one for the new age. We need good designers because the obvious answer for nearly everything is wrong. I think that's a very good point of humility for us to start thinking about how we create success in the new economy. And here's another equally difficult quote, which we must all get our heads around. This man, Jeff Crossick, is the Vice Chancellor, until recently, the Vice Chancellor of London University. He said, the problem that higher education has is that it is creating an education system for kids and young people for jobs that have not yet been invented. How does the education system respond? Now, all of us are struggling with that question. And one of the things I find interesting is that I think to some extent in Korea, you look to us in the UK and think, how do we manage our education system to ensure that we have so many creative people in the UK? We look at Korea and say, how are these people making their economy grow so fast? We need a Samsung, we want an LG, we want a Hyundai. So nobody has got the complete answer. We are having to learn from each other that in this new economy, the technology is changing so fast, business practice is changing so fast, consumer behavior is changing so fast, that you cannot take anything for granted. And the way we have to focus our education systems is to teach young people about creativity, about flexibility, about being able to work together as part of a team, about learning how to learn. Rather than learning a given set of facts and figures, we have to learn how to be much more adaptable. So with all that as background, a few points on how do we create successful content, which I think is the real purpose of the day today. So here's one interesting line, again from a report by the United Nations. There is no single creative economy. There is a multitude of local trajectories. Now, what they mean by that is that each country, each city, each region, each community has its own routes for developing creative industries. And one of the reasons why cities have become so important in the development of these new industries is because there is a diversity in all the world's great cities. This is a picture of a particular kind of diversity of wealth and poverty side by side. But we know that in every big city in the world now, there are different communities. There's managerial knowledge, there's technical knowledge, there's academic knowledge, there's intellectual knowledge, and it's that mixture of diverse feed lines within cities that help to build a real creative industry. And here's another quote from the United Nations. We need to think less in terms of needs and more in terms of positive capabilities. Now, very often I think we look at how we develop creative industries to think, what are the things that we have not got that we need to develop? It's a much stronger starting point to say, what are the things that we have got which are strong and powerful and unique to us that we can grow for our own purposes. Two very quick examples. A small town in Scotland, Dundee, had a publisher producing a children's comic book. The comic book was going to go out of business. It was going bankrupt. And there were 10 illustrators who went to the local university and said, we are going to be out of a job. Can you put on a course that would teach us some basic skills of digital animation? Because they were all very good draftsmen and illustrators. The university established the course, and now, 10 or 15 years later, it is one of the world's leading universities for the video games industry. Now, that did not happen because somebody said, let's invent the video games industry. It happened because there were some local people who needed a particular skill, and they built on the strength that was already there. And one of my criticisms of some governments, I think very, very often, for example, the Chinese government sometimes takes an attitude, we should start a big creative industry here. You can't drop these things out of the sky. They have to grow from the ground. They are part of our culture. And in the same way that if you want to grow pineapples, you don't grow pineapples in Sweden because they won't grow. You grow them in Hawaii or somewhere where it's warm. We have to think about how we grow creative industries from in the right soil, with the right climate, with the right social and cultural context. Now, this is something which is probably very difficult for every government in the world to accept, but it is one of the key issues in creating great creative content, I'm sure. This comes from the staff manual of the Cisco Corporation. Now, Cisco is a huge company. It employs, 20,000 people around the world. But one of the things they tell their staff, it is better to ask forgiveness than to seek permission. In other words, if you have an idea, you should do something about that idea. Don't wait until your boss has said, okay, try it. Now, I said to one of the senior managers in Cisco, do you really do this, or do you fire the people who try it? And he said, no, we try to operate on this basis of encouraging people to take risks. Because, of course, creativity, by its nature, is disruptive. And that means that if we are going to be really pioneering and innovative in creative content, we should expect to fail as often as we succeed. If we're not failing as often as we succeed, we're probably not being as creative as we could be or should be. But it's a very difficult lesson for a government, or indeed for a big company, or for an investor to accept. But failure is a very important part of success in the creative industries. We all know this because there are hundreds and hundreds of ideas all the time coming out. Not many of them succeed. But it's only by having a high proportion of failures that you get to the 2 or 3 real successes that will change the world and grow businesses. Now, another issue is around brand. I've chosen this picture because it is probably the best known picture in the world. Now, that is a tiny bit of paint on a tiny bit of canvas. It's worth nothing. It's a very small picture which is quite dark. If you go to the Louvre in Paris to see it, it's quite difficult to see it. And yet it is priceless. It has a brand value which is nothing to do with the intrinsic value of the painting. And it's something which we need to bear in mind, I think, in thinking about the creative industries, that brand identity is what is really important in establishing the value of any product or service. And it's not just the Mona Lisa. Here's a pair of shoes by a shoe designer called Manolo Blahnik. Now, the price of the leather and the price of the stitching in these shoes may be a few dollars, but the shoes sell for thousands of dollars. Why? Because of the value of the intellectual property which is tied up in the design and the brand identity of those shoes. And of course, one of the things that happens with a product like that is that many people pirate it. That's always going to be an issue which we have to think about, and we have to work internationally to make sure that piracy does not undermine the value of the creative industries. But there's another issue here as well, and that is that these ideas, even something like a pair of shoes, comes out of a designer working with a skilled craftsman or craftswoman who makes the shoes, working with a skilled marketeer who's marketing the shoes. Those people have to trust each other and work together. And if we don't have a degree of trust in developing ideas in the creative industries, then we go nowhere. And I think here in Korea, where you have big conglomerates, where a lot of the work that goes on is in-house, it's inside the company, the model that we have in the UK is much more lots and lots of small companies working together. Now, they may compete with each other, but they must also trust each other. So learning to trust, learning to create safe environments in which people can collaborate on developing new ideas together and trust each other is crucial for the creative industries. And another point, you can take nothing for granted in developing your content industries. This is Aalto University in Finland. Now, I'm sure many of you know, probably better than me, that Finland, tiny country, 4 million people, the Finnish economy was almost the same thing as the Nokia economy. Nokia was a huge part of the success of the Finnish economy. But we also know that Nokia, a technology company, just suddenly started going down the hill. And the Finnish government thought, what do we do about this? How do we re-energize our economy? And they did a very brave thing. They got a business college, an engineering college, and an art college, and they said, we want you to work together to have one university, Aalto University, and Aalto means creative. So it's the Creative University of Finland, because they realized that just relying on engineering was not enough to give them success in the creative economy. They needed to have a mixture of engineering and technical skills and artistic skills and business skills. And Aalto University is already becoming very successful. But my message here is you can't take anything for granted. Success today does not necessarily mean success tomorrow. And we have to be thinking all the time about re-energizing the way we understand content and the drivers of content. So here's a quick example of that. This is the cover of a research project in the UK into a city called Brighton, which is about 70 kilometers from London, on the seaside, very nice place to live. Lots of young digital entrepreneurs go there. The government's Arts and Humanities Research Council undertook a research project with 500 digital media companies in the Brighton area, and they called their report Brighton Fuse. And what they discovered was this: the companies where the technology graduates, the arts graduates, and the business graduates worked together in equal partnership were the companies that were growing 3 times faster than other companies in the area, making the same products with the same degree of talent, but not getting these 3 factors in harmonious balance with each other: the technology, the arts, and the business. And they called them superfused companies because by fusing these skills together, not having the technologists as the bosses, or the business people as the bosses, or the arts people as the bosses, but people learning to work together as a harmonious partnership, they were creating the most interesting content and were the most successful businesses. Not only growing 3 times faster than the other businesses in their area, but growing 10 times faster than the basic underlying growth rate in the UK economy. And here is a quotation from one of the people who was involved in that project. The task for policymakers is to help creative businesses better capture the value of what they produce, that is, the intellectual property value, and address barriers such as ensuring education and government systems value interdisciplinary skills and avoid skills silos. That does not mean that we all have to become both engineers and artists. It means that the technologists and the creative artists must respect each other and learn to work together effectively. A very simple message, but it's one which it's very difficult for companies to really accept in the day-to-day realities of business. So I come on finally to Creative England, the organization I chair. This is a public agency with some private commercial investment also. And we invest in small companies, we give loans to small companies, we provide business support, we mentor small businesses, we help them grow and to access international markets, we encourage them to be more ambitious, and we also encourage them to think about the fact that the creative economy is now much more widespread in its impact than it was even a few years ago. So we have an investment project with the National Health Service in the UK where video games businesses are working with doctors to develop games for elderly people and people with dementia to manage their own healthcare more effectively. We're also working with some of the high-end engineering and manufacturing businesses because they also enjoy finding out about the creative skills that go on in what has previously been the entertainment sector. We've got a scheme going with Microsoft and with Sony and with Unilever, 3 big conglomerate businesses where we take small companies to them and we say, we will invest £50,000 in this business, you invest £50,000 in this business, and we'll see if we can grow it together. It's been very, very successful. So we try and encourage the big companies to work with the little companies because the big companies get access to interesting creative ideas which otherwise they might not be able to generate in-house, and the small companies get from the big company the benefit of well-managed, well-planned, well-thought-through businesses, because many creative businesses start with a great project, but they are not very good at establishing themselves as a sustainable business. And they can learn from the existing business community the kind of business skills they need. But most of all, what we do at Creative England is we encourage people to talk to each other. That may sound like a very simple, obvious, even a stupid thing to say, but actually this is the most effective way to get the kind of high-quality content which we think is coming out of the work that we do in the UK. We get the universities to talk with the private investors to talk with the local authorities to talk with the schools. It's very, very simple, getting people to work together, because all the things I was saying earlier, in this new economy, there are so many unknown factors that it's only by working together and sharing that we can create the sort of solid content industries that we all need for the future. And finally, one of the beliefs that we have, if you like, at Creative England is that talent is everywhere. We work only outside London, and we do that because in the UK, and I'm sure it's the same here in Korea, because Seoul is such a big, powerful city in the Korean context. If you're working in Seoul, it's good. If you're outside Seoul, it's probably much more difficult to get access to finance, access to markets, to meet the people that you need to meet, and so on. Our view is that in the UK, we're losing millions of opportunities because there are talented people with great ideas, but they are outside London, and they're missing an opportunity to develop their skills and to develop their ideas. And our view is we cannot afford, in this new environment, to allow those lost opportunities. So we work outside London to encourage people to work with us on raising their ambition. And there's another issue here, and this is where I'll draw to a close, which I think is a very, very important point, and that is that in thinking about these content industries, of course we're thinking about the future of our economies, and we're thinking about growing the wealth and GDP of our countries. But there is something else, I think, more fundamental and important here, and is this: in the 20th century, the one factor that drove the world economy was oil. We all recognize this. The industrial economies that we've created in the 20th century have been dependent on oil. It's also becoming very clear that success in the 21st century depends on creativity. And in the same way that oil was the basic product that drove all success in the industrial societies of the 20th century, creativity must be the quality that is driving economic success in the 21st century. That's why we can't afford to waste talent wherever it is. And of course there's another issue, which is that oil is a resource which is depleted through use. The more we take it out of the ground, the less oil there is in the ground, and eventually there will be nothing left. The extraordinary thing about creativity is the more you use it, the more it grows. It's the opposite of oil. Oil gets less and less the more you use it. Creativity gets more and more you use it. And so, in our view, and one of the things that we're trying to do in Creative England, is the societies which really understand that and learn how to mobilize not just a few people with good connections and great ideas, but learn to mobilize a very large number of young people to think about creativity and to think creatively. They are the societies which are going to be economically successful, but also socially and culturally successful in the 21st century. So, thank you.
Thank you, Mr. John Yubigin.